Okay? So, and he also makes that little thing about and to your offsprings referring to many, but to your offspring referring to one. What he's saying is sometimes when God talks about Abraham's offspring, sometimes he means like all of his offspring. You know, your offspring will be more numerous than the sand of the seashores, right? He's obviously talking about a bunch of people. Well, sometimes he says, you know, and through your offspring all nations of the earth will be blessed. Sometimes he's talking specifically about Jesus Christ, who as a Jew, right, is descended from Abraham. So he's just saying that sometimes these Old Testament things about offspring, sometimes they're talking about Jesus Christ specifically. And yeah, so that, and he uses that again later. So just kind of keep that in your head. When Paul says offspring from now on, he's talking specifically about Jesus Christ. Now, we've established all this about the law, and that it doesn't save us. It was never meant to. God didn't give the law to get people to heaven, because no one ever made it to heaven by keeping the law. So, the obvious question is, well, what in the world was the law for in the first place? Right? I mean, if he was just always going to save everybody by faith, why in the world would he burden the Jews for generations and generations with all these rules that weren't ever going to get him into heaven anyway? What was the point of all this? Right? And so, this is the question that Paul tries to tackle for the rest of this chapter, and that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day. Okay? So he starts out in verse 19. Why then the law? Right? There's the question. Why the law? It was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Alright. Start that verse at the beginning and we'll just walk right through it. Right? It was added because of transgressions. Well, there are a lot of different ways you can take that, and all of them are kind of true. Right? You could say that, well, that means that he gave us to deal with our sins temporarily through the sacrifices, right? Well, if you had a sin, you killed an animal, God forgave your sin, and that sin was dealt with. You know? Sweet. And that's totally true. Right? You could also say that God gave the law to hold us back from sinning. Normally I do that, but I forgot today. You could say that he gave the law to hold us back from sinning, to restrain our sin nature, right? Which is totally true. Because you've got all these specific laws written down. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and don't do this. Granted, it's not perfect, but at least some guidance is better than none. You know? And it certainly, at some times in Israel's history, they were less sinful than the nations around them. Sometimes they were just as sinful, but sometimes they were better. And a big part of that was because they had this law written down that said, don't do these things. If you do these things, everybody's going to throw rocks at you until you die. Which is a pretty good, vehicle for keeping people from doing bad things. The third one, and this is the one that Paul's got in his mind right now, I think, and the most important for this little passage, is to reveal our inability to live righteously and our need for salvation. Okay? So God lays out this humongous system of rules and says, if you do all this thing, if you do all these things for all your life, then that's what it takes. Like, then you can live in harmony with me. You can be righteous enough to hang with God. And, the Jews are like, I'm sure at first, they're like, yes, sweet, I just do all this stuff. And they start, and then they mess up. And it's like, oh, there I go, can't do it. And so we've got like hundreds of years, thousands of years of history behind Galatians that says people can't keep the law. Peter even says in Acts 15, why in the world would we, Christians, want to burden these Gentiles with the law which we can't keep, and our fathers couldn't keep, and their fathers couldn't keep, and all the way back to Moses? No one's been able to keep it. Why would we want to lay that burden on people? So, right, the main purpose of the law, I believe, and I think the one that Paul's talking about here, is to reveal our sinfulness and hopefully make us ready, make the Jews ready for the coming Messiah. Whenever they see a way that they can get to God, they'll jump right on it and say, yes, this is so much better than what we had before. Okay? So it was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come. Right? This is a temporary system. The law was put in place until Jesus comes. This is one of those times where offspring means Jesus. Right? The law was there until Jesus came, to whom the promise had been made. Made the promise to Abraham, and by extension to Christ. And it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Now, an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. Now, what in the world does all this talk about angels and intermediaries? It's pretty simple. If you go back and read Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy, when they tell something about when Moses got the law, and it just says there were angels there. So the Bible talks about angels being there when Moses got the law. Not sure what they did, but they were there, up on the mountain. God, Moses, and some angels getting the law. And this is something that a lot of Jews did back in this day. Just because Moses carried the law from God to the people, they kind of thought that the law came from Moses. It was Moses' law, that Moses got it. No, he's saying. Now, just because there's an intermediary, just because Moses carried the law from God to the people, doesn't mean that it was Moses' law. It was God's law all along. He's just saying, don't make that mistake. Don't get confused about that. Law is totally from God. All right. Now, he rolls on to verse 21 and asks another question, another really good question. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Right, that's a super good question. There are a lot of people who kind of don't know that, or they really think it is. I've run into people all the time. He's okay. I run into people all the time who think that there's, and to a certain extent they're right. Because you've got the law, and you've got the promise, and they're fighting against each other, and one of them's the right way, and one of them's the wrong way. And they're right, but once you understand that the law was never meant to save people, then it makes sense why they're not fighting against one another, right? If God gave us the law to save us, well then, you can be saved by the law, and you can be saved by the promise, and there's two different ways, right? And the people who are on the law side are saying, you promise people are on the wrong side. And the people who are on the promise side can say, you people following the law are on the wrong side. But there's really only one way. The law was never meant to save folks. So Paul says, is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, right, if the law had been given to give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. So he's just saying what I said. The law was never intended to do the same thing that the promise was. Right? These aren't opposite things. I lost my place. But, verse 22, but the Scripture imprisoned everything under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. Alright, so, now we're back to this blessing-curse idea that the law has built right into it. Right? You're either on the blessing side of the law, you keep it, you're blessed, you break it, you're cursed. So the whole purpose of the law was to make it clear that everyone fell on the curse side. Right? No human being that ever lived was on the blessing side of the law. Right? Some people kept it pretty well, but nobody kept it all perfect. Until Jesus Christ came. Right? We see that in verse 23, right? So now before faith came, we were held captive under the law. We're all here under the curse umbrella. Imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. We're stuck here until this new covenant, this new thing that Christ brought, would show up. Okay? And that was, so the law, if you think about it, is the reason why Christ is the only person qualified to save us. Because He's the only individual in all of human history that comes in on the blessing side of the law. You see what I'm saying? The only person to ever keep it was Jesus Christ. He's the only one entitled to the blessings promised in the law. So He's the only place we can go to get the blessings promised in the law. Yeah. Now, we're up to verse 24. So then, right, in view of all this, the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. Now, in order to get a good handle on this next part, we've got to talk a little bit about the way society worked back then. Because Paul launches into this analogy here of children. Right? You know, we read it and we say, well, the law was our guardian until Christ came. The King James renders guardian schoolmaster. Right? And we read that, well, the law was our teacher until Christ came. And those words, you know, schoolmaster, guardian, teacher, have the right sense, but unless you understand exactly how society worked back then, you're missing some of the depth of what he's saying. The way things worked then is that if I was a Roman citizen and a landowner, and I had full rights as a citizen, and I had a child, my son, in that times, because sons were the ones who got all the stuff, right? My son I would place him in the care of a team of slaves. There would be a guardian like a tutor who taught him and like dealt with him in that way, and then there would be what's the word? Paul uses the word later. A manager, yeah, a manager who took care of all of his property while he was a child, and then there's a clear dividing line between children and adults. You still see this in like the Jewish idea of the bar mitzvah, right? When you get to be so old, you have a ceremony. You wake up in the morning, a child, and you go to bed that night as an adult. I mean, it is a line. You are a child, now you're an adult. They didn't have this idea of like adolescence, like a transition from childhood to adulthood. You were one or the other. There's no middle ground. And so, while these people were children, they were, for all practical purposes, treated like the slaves of the household. They were under the care of the slaves in the household. Right? And so, there were slaves who had more standing and more authority than the heir did. Does that make sense?